Thank you very much for coming, everybody. Welcome to How to Run a Consultancy in 30 Minutes. I'm Dan Minkin. I'm based in Auckland, New Zealand. I'm now a consultant, coach, trainer for consultancies of all size. Realistically, I was previously a former country director at one of the largest software testing consultancies in the world, Planet. And as far as I know, I'm the only person who specializes in these services across New Zealand or even Australia. At least I haven't met anybody yet. And that's interesting to me because I don't really understand why that's the case. Why aren't there more? Why isn't there people who focus on helping consultancies do the right things? Despite having there being nearly over 500 people in Planet New Zealand when I left, I never received any training, at least not in running consultancies, because it doesn't seem to exist. Lots of information out there on starting or growing or scaling consultancies, and a growing body of literature on what we call professionalizing for sale. But much of that I think is hyperbole. So since my retirement, let me call it, from large-scale consultancy management, I've spent the last 6 months or so trying to create material to fill quite a big gap in the consultancy educational market. And my goal is to rectify that gap, to make it easier for the next generation of consultancy leaders to understand everything that they have to do when they're put in a position of leadership in a professional services firm or a consultancy. So I'm going to try and share as much as I can in the hour that we have. Just a few things before we start. This is a part one. Okay, so I'm going to look to do a part two, which is about getting the best out of your employees, and probably about a part three about partnering with clients as well. So if part one interests you, then keep your eye out for part two and part three on danminkin.com, which is my website. And I have about 30 topics to cover and 30 minutes to do it in. I have practiced it, and I think it's going to take about 35 minutes. So it's a lot to cover, a lot to take in. So the session's being recorded, and I'll make that available to you. In fact, I almost apologize about how much there is in here. So I think to go back through, if you want to really get the best out of it, to go back through the recording is probably a good idea. If you've got any questions, put them in the chat as we go along. I'll keep my eye on, see if anyone else needs to come into the meeting. I expected about 15. We're on 14 at the moment. For those of you who are interested in the material and possibly learning a little bit more about what I've got to say, there is an offer at the end, because I have a course that provides a lot of more detail in the types of things that I'm going to discuss today. So here we go. Firstly, what are we covering? Let's see, let's move the slide pack along. What we are covering today in How to Run a Consultancy in 30 Minutes is firstly, how to structure and organize the consultancy. So we're going to look at choosing an internal structure, getting the employee model right, building up the internal functions, and we'll look at using both permanent and contractor resources for the delivery team. Next, how to be an executive leader, be that top level of leadership. The tasks you need to look at there: setting direction, continually improving the strategy, making sure that the decisions are made in the best interests of the company, that's governance, looking at operating model very quickly, and what we call representing the company to the local, to the internal and the external stakeholders. Next is how to be a divisional leader by creating a local management and delivery team, empowering that team, evangelizing the vision, and getting the best out of the team through modeling the right behaviors, which I think is a really important section. How to be a local delivery leader, the top rung of the technical ladder, but the beginnings of a leadership role. We look at culture, challenging the divisional plans, doing some workforce planning, KPIs, and again, getting the best out of the delivery team as well. And then finally, how to manage consultancy finances. We'll look at 4 types of money, quickly look at a profit and loss, building a budget, setting and changing rates, and we also have a quick look at utilization as well. What I'm not covering, nothing in depth on talent management or client management, account management type things, or anything on business development. The webinar acknowledges the need for these functions, but doesn't necessarily go into the detail. As I say, keep your eyes out for part 2 and part 3 over the coming months. And there will be time for Q&A at the end. Hopefully have about 20 minutes. So let's see if I can fit all of this in 30 minutes from now. So here we go. Firstly, I'm going to start with scale and structure, because the scale of the organization has an effect on every function and activity. I like to start there. And the transition from a single person business to a consultancy is a multi-event, multi-year journey for most people. And these different growth stages require focus on different things to optimize performance. So take a quick look at the diagram on the screen. It's got a 7-stage model for consultancy growth, which is something I've designed with approximate numbers of delivery employees there. So I'll just run through a couple of examples. For example, at stage 1, you tend to be founder or founders only. Your focus tends to be on building relationships and finding your initial pieces of work. Stage 2, you're founder run, building up your delivery team. And stage 3, you're founder managed, and you appoint the management team, that's going to take you forward at that point. By the time you get to stages 4, 5, and 6, and 7, you're putting in a much bigger executive team there. You'll have a full layer of executive, divisional, local leadership by stage 6. And by stage 7, which is the pinnacle of this model, you've got a board, a governance, and you are one of the biggest. You're a multi-stage player at that point. What you need to do really is act your size. Okay, you don't need to do level 7 activities at level 3. That tends to be a waste. Next, decide on how to internally structure and do so in a way that's appropriate for your scale. And there are several ways to do this, several models to choose from. And you have a monolithic model, which tends to contain all organizational functions into a single hierarchy, all activities across the organization centrally performed and managed. A geographical structure, which replicates itself as it expands, and each unit performs its own functions. Then we have functionally structured firms, and they tend to divide themselves primarily by major internal activities such as business development, people management, and account management. Practice-based firms who organize themselves around specialism, technical specialism. Domain-based firms who tend to organize around external industry sectors or possibly technologies. And finally, you might have partner-based organizations, and they include multiple, often disparate mini businesses under the control of individual leaders called partners. Choose a structure that suits your scale. This probably means change as you grow. And at the higher levels of scale, you may need to have multiple structures and matrix management. Next, clearly define your internal functions. And it's useful to be able to think of the organization, no matter what the size, in terms of functions that need to be performed. These functions could be shared across the organization or replicated within those individual units that we've talked about. And there are 3 broad groupings of functions within our model. We have a leadership, when the role of the leadership is to steer the company towards the vision and set the strategy for the operations teams to follow. We tend to divide, I think it's useful to divide consultancy leadership into executive, divisional, and local leadership, all of whom have a greater or lesser responsibility for leading the company. Next, we have operations, including everything that comes under talent management, workforce management, BD, account management, and of course, client delivery team sit there under the operations banner. And then we have business enablement, all the functions that support the rest of the company, finance, HR, and process management, I like to think comes under here as well. The most effective consultancies are very clear on their internal functions and the internal value that each function delivers to the other as well. Next, decide on your operational employee model. And a consultancy organization can be considered a matrix of functions and seniority. The intersection of function and level gives us a specific title, specific position with a specific title, I mean. Of course, titles can vary greatly across organizations for what's essentially the same role. But the concept generally is the same in hierarchical organizations across the globe, I think. On screen is an example of a 3-level approach for operational functions. And at the top, there's a 2-level organizational management structure. I think this might be suitable for a larger company, but probably overkill for a smaller one. Example position descriptions are included there on the diagram. The operational approach is going to be different from the delivery approach, which may need more roles, in part to give graded promotion opportunities and to enable granularity in costing and rates for clients. Even small organizations need an employee ladder. It's a vital way of attracting and retaining people. Next, you choose your strategic scaling approach. And there are two primary ways to scale: using permanent employees and using contractors. A permanent employee is hired directly by the company, becomes part of the workforce, whilst a contractor is somebody who tends to work for themselves, who's hired on a temporary basis. And permanent staff offer the benefits of increased availability, retention of IP, a more competitive and flexible pricing model. They tend to be cheaper, and the ability to create value outside of assignments, which is very important in growing consultancies. The downside for permanent employees is that costs are mostly fixed. There is a longer period of waiting for profit. And there is obviously a considerable overhead of managing the finances, the legalities, the HR for every individual as well. The use of contractors obviously has some advantages, because many organizations use lots of contractors, better cash flow and easier cost management primarily, larger resource pools, and you obviously have ease of scaling both up and down. It's easier to find, but it's also easier to let go of contractors than it is permanent employees. The drawbacks include the difficulty or the risk with determining a cultural fit, an independent attitude, uncertainty about resource quality, potentially, and higher costs compared to permanent resources, and therefore lower margins. There is also difficulty in building up long-term IP with a contractor-only model. You can, of course, use both, and many companies do, in which case your contractor ratio becomes the key lever to keep the advantages and the disadvantages even. Now, I'll take a quick drink at that point, and we'll move on to leading the organization. Thank you. So now we've covered structure, we need to think about leadership. And this section here is primarily about what the executive team do. So firstly, they need to set the direction. We could call this setting strategy, though strategy is a word with many definitions. And not necessarily just setting direction. So here's everything that goes into this step, in my view. Defining your purpose or your mission, your fundamental reason for doing what you're doing. Then you've got your values, which support this. And these are your fundamental beliefs about what is important and what is right. Your value proposition, which encapsulates the value that you will provide to those who engage with you. And I think these three elements are the necessary foundations, but further elements contain detail. The vision comes next for me, sitting on the middle ground between the what and the how. And the vision describes the desired long-term results of your efforts. The goals, which support the vision by providing detail and targets. And the strategy or strategies, and notice I'm using that in a particular way. These are the specific choices taken to achieve a certain goal. Setting direction is necessary, but just as important is communicating the direction, which means the rest of the organization, the rest of your organization knows where to go. So that's setting the direction. Oh, interesting. Setting the direction, but strategy can't be set and forget. So what if you need to change direction in order to keep it optimized for the conditions? And there are only two rules in my mind here when you're changing direction. One is be clear on the extent of the change from the strategy, and then communicate exactly what's changed. And to be clear on the extent of change, we can categorize any improvement as one of four types: a change of focus, a change of activity, a strategic change, or a foundational change. And I won't go into the definitions here. There's a lot behind this topic, but generally they go from smallest to largest. And the higher the impact or level, the more rigorous the decision-making process needs to be. Because if you get it wrong at the highest levels, the consequences can be quite extreme. So all strategic improvement activities need to be communicated, along with the reasons, as they've got a knock-on effect to your divisional activities, as well as KPIs and goals for individuals. Next, you need to put in systems and processes to make sure that decisions are always made in the best interests of the company, which is what governance is all about. And you can look at governance from, very simply, from an external and an internal point of view. So for external governance, this includes your legal obligations, industry regulations, compliance standards, and meeting societal expectations. You might bring that under governance as well. Includes things like social responsibility or diversity and inclusion. Also includes meeting any other external stakeholder expectations. The internal governance focuses on how decisions are made, processes to be followed, business continuity planning, risk management processes, and professional or ethical behavior within the organization. The larger the organization, the more you need to think about governance. And one key question for you: who decides what's in the best interests of the company? Or who makes the call when there's a critical issue? Is it the shareholders? Is it the board? The executive, the partners? Do employees even have a say? I don't think it's a straightforward answer, but it's one as a leader or a group of leaders you need to be crystal clear on. Certainly get your own opinion on that. Here's another question for you as we move through. If you or an employee of yours has a query about who does what in the organization or how you should do something, where do you go? You probably ask somebody, or you might have an email about it from 2 years ago if you could just find it. But actually, that's what the purpose of the operating model is. And it's one of the most important things an organization should create, in my view. It includes things like the organizational model, the value chains, the detailed processes, organizational charts, how cross-structure communication is performed, as well as any data requirements that you might need to manage your organization. And there are many other things as well. Having a well-defined operating model delivers clear benefit to me. It brings consistency and scalability to the organization and clarity and empowerment to individuals. My advice, if you have more than one person in a company, document the operating model. I think it's very important in the long run, and your employees will thank you, I believe. Organizational communication is obviously key at the executive level, and consultancies face specific challenges when considering organizational communication, including the fact that most consultants work remotely to the head office, as well as the matrix management nature of many consultancies. So here's an example of a framework that I've used that might help. It's called the 5 Bs, and the 5 Bs are to be reliable, meaning you ensure communication occurs regularly and predictably. Being honest means focusing on organizational transparency where possible. And even if you can't disclose details of a particular issue or don't know all the answer yet, then at least acknowledge the issue. Being timely means communicating when the issue is relevant or is otherwise on people's minds. And being relevant means providing information that individual groups will find useful or informative. And the final B is to be interactive, which means striving to create engagement and two-way conversations. I've found these very useful principles actually for organizational communication. So hopefully this will give you a simple framework. And finally, within this section, we use representation to describe the act of representing the company to key audiences so that the organization is seen in the best possible light. And I think focusing leadership energy on profile gives the company a number of benefits. It builds confidence in the leadership, gives a higher market profile, increased organizational stability, I think, comes from rock solid communication, and eventually, hopefully, higher sales as well. So there are, in effect, always 3 stakeholder audiences for a consultancy executive member. Firstly, the internal audience, where individuals within the company require visibility and high visibility from the leadership so that they feel connected with the individuals who run the company. Secondly, with clients, where you're able to get a direct line of communication between the consultancy and the client's top decision makers. And then finally, the market as a whole, where leaders can have a substantial effect on brand image and increasing the visibility of the company in the wider business market. These three aspects are critical for the executive, but they can also be used as guidelines for the next layer of leadership. It doesn't have to be an executive responsibility to represent the company. In fact, it shouldn't. Section 3. The executive aren't the only leaders in the organization, of course. An organization of any scale will have divisional leaders, as well as the senior delivery individuals that we talked about, who act as the local leaders. So in this section, I'm just going to look at what a divisional leader needs to do. And the first thing a divisional leader needs to do is create a leadership team. And depending on the size of the business, here's a few roles that you should consider. They include the client or account manager, responsible for client relationships and account growth. Business development manager, responsible for new business opportunities, client acquisition. Sometimes there's a service manager who oversees delivery of services to an individual client. Or a practice manager who's responsible for a wide range of internal and externally focused activities, focusing on the specialism of the practice. We have a people manager responsible for careers, people's careers, employee careers. And a workforce manager who is responsible for matching assignments to employees. The capability manager is responsible for developing the skills of the whole group, and a HR manager who looks at strategic people issues across the entire workforce, not just the operational delivery people. And notice the balance between the people-focused roles and the service and client-focused roles. I think that balance is important in creating a team. And to get the best out of the team, you need to empower that team. So having clear management frameworks is more effective than management by control in consultancies for many reasons, including the what we call the independent and naturally challenging nature of consultancy employees. And at a minimum, I'd recommend the following. Firstly, a RACI or a RASCI, which I actually prefer. That helps give clarity about ownership of processes. So everyone's clear on who does what, and people can focus on their own role. Next, a DOA matrix. That details the financial levels of approval related to business processes. And finally, a decision log, which stores details about decisions taken. This means you have a clear history of how a decision was arrived at, which can be very useful when you go back to look at it. And in my opinion, these three tools allow both empowerment and sufficient organizational control, and they're relatively easy to implement. Just as important as processes is modeling the right behaviors. And because the experts who are hired for and work in most professional services organizations like consultancies don't always take well in being told what to do or exactly how to do it. They tend to be independent-minded, experts in their specialism, and they're taught to clarify and challenge as part of their role. So you can't rely on control. So how do you get people to follow your direction as a consultancy leader? And I think that a leader's most powerful tool in this situation is to model the right behavior. But what kind of things to be models? Okay, so the types of leadership behavior that tend to be effective in consultancies are indirect, collaborative, supportive type behaviors. And 4 of the most effective leadership behaviors include leadership through professional expertise. That means walking the walk so that people trust where you're taking them. Strategic thinking, so that people want to go with you for the long run. They understand the vision. Values-based behavior, so that people are comfortable with how the organization intends to get there. And leadership through political capital, which helps you influence individuals and groups in a given direction. These are 4 very important behaviors, I think, and a leader can probably get the best out of their local team by building up expertise across these 4 models. As well as a management team, you need a delivery team, of course. And one key question is, how many seniors do you need compared to juniors? This depends on what we call your leverage strategy. And leverage is based on the principle that a small amount of personal effort in the form of direction from senior experienced people can be turned into a large amount of team effort when other individuals are used as levers to magnify the output. Okay, so this means you get best value from having a certain ratio of senior to intermediate or junior resources. This then frees up the seniors to do other things. And there's no one way to do this. There are several models. For example, you can have a top-heavy model or a hierarchical model, and there is a pear-shaped model or an egg timer model. Well, lots of different models. Each of them have pros and cons. And the key takeaway here for me is that when you're building your delivery team, you need to choose a model and then monitor your chosen model to ensure the organization is keeping to it and using leverage as you planned it to. Once you have your team in place, you want to align the team with the strategy. And one key way to do this is the divisional plan. There may already be a documented organizational strategy and plan, which is a document that includes key strategic elements such as the purpose, the vision, the values, as we covered earlier. But it also includes often more detailed planning elements such as a roadmap, an organizational structure, and budgets. The divisional plan is similar, but focuses on what an individual division needs to implement. As such, it contains much of the same kind of information, but is more specific to the local market conditions or the divisional conditions, more detailed, so it can be used as a directional tool by the local leadership team. It's not necessary always to sign off the plan. Instead, I'd advise you to consider it a working document that should be amended when the situation demands it. And I think that the process of creating the plan itself can be beneficial. If it's a collaborative effort between leader and team, that will increase buy-in as well as understanding. And finally, within this section, you always need to think about the future and how to create a pool of your next generation leaders. And succession planning is the process of identifying those key organizational positions which are currently filled or will be in demand, identifying individuals who can perform these roles in the future, and then putting in place mechanisms to upskill the individuals so that they can step into those roles when the time becomes right. And I think this is really important in consultancies because of relatively high turnover, the problem of dead man's shoes, which is, waiting endlessly for opportunity at that next rung, and in many cases, the innate conservatism in consultancies. As part of the process, you identify critical roles. These include roles that are critical for future goals, roles that require specialist or hard to replace knowledge, roles which are hard to recruit for due to current or future shortage trends, roles that would cause organizational damage if they were absent, and finally, roles that give commercial or competitive advantage for the future. These are the roles you should focus on in succession planning. Succession planning is a valuable process that most consultancies, I think, leave until too late because business as usual activities always take precedence. Section 4, how to lead the delivery team. A quick break. So that's the role of the divisional leader we've just covered, but local leaders and managers are equally important and influential. And one key focus for a local leader, culture. Organizational culture has a huge effect on long-term business performance. So what do we mean by culture? What makes up the culture of an organization? For me, it's the shared values and beliefs that are expressed by an organization, its behaviors, its practices. It's not just in the policies or what's written in the value statement. It's much more than that. It includes, how decisions are made, the amount of transparency within the organization, how open the relationship between senior management and employee base is. So here are some considerations that leaders can focus on for building an intentional culture. Firstly, you're a consultancy, so focus on bringing your remote parties together. Celebrate employee wins just as much as client wins and reward them equally, so you've got balance. Encourage a learning and development culture because consultancy is fundamentally about knowledge. Embed diversity and inclusion practices because it's the right thing to do. Encourage well-being, because consultancy is a unique pressure proposition, in my view. And finally, if you want to make a real difference, promote ethical consultancy, training leaders how to deal with conflict of interest or confidentiality and elements like that. Be very purposeful if you can in building your culture. You need to in a consultancy. A local leader is key in supporting the division in making sure the company has sufficient capacity and capability to meet current and future requirements. And that's what demand planning is. And there's a process for it, which popped up on the screen. The process is based on understanding that any future work is divided into one of 4 categories. And those categories are contracted work, which has been signed and agreed, extensions, which are extended continuations of current assignments, not yet signed, though need to be planned for, forecast work, which is work that is being scoped, sized or planned. Pipeline work is the 4th one, which are the leads and the opportunities that you're exploring or developing only at this point. And by mapping when work is likely to land within each of these categories, you can create a basic workforce or demand plan. It's not a difficult exercise. And demand planning really helps smooth out the demand and supply for you. It's a key indicator, in my mind, of maturity in an organization. And how do you know if you're achieving goals? That's the next question. If the executive team has set direction properly with goals, then you'll measure success against these goals with KPIs. And this is where a balanced scorecard approach comes in, which is a method which translates the organization's strategic goals into a set of organizational performance objectives. And importantly, it widens the definition of business performance to encompass more than just pure financial measures. And there are 4 perspectives to a balanced scorecard. If you don't know the model, there is the financial, which likely includes traditional financial measurements, revenue, profit, and so on. The customer angle, which is there to recognize the importance of customer experience in the success of any organization. Operational, it's about the health and the internal workings of the consultancy. And learning and growth, which is about how the consultancy is able to change and improve. The balanced scorecard, I think, is a great approach, not to measure everything, but to measure those things which have the greatest impact on business performance. So it's a truism that what gets measured gets done. So targets often should relate to the goals that you've set for the organization. But how you get to those organizational goals, the route taken is dependent on internal, external factors. And this requires monitoring and sometimes change. Sometimes you need to focus on one KPI because it will be more effective on getting to a certain goal at that point in time. And emphasizing certain targets and de-emphasizing others can affect organizational behavior a lot, but it needs to be clearly communicated. And there are risks if you do this that some things are communicated as therefore less important. By going one step further than this, by incentivizing behavior, you can communicate that certain behavior is so important that a cash or financial reward can be achieved. The key takeaway for me on this section is that if you emphasize or incentivize achieving certain targets, then expect all efforts beyond what gets rewards. So you have to make sure you incentivize the right things. Let's talk briefly progress tracking. 2 key methods for progress tracking against the plan: meetings and reports. The meetings that you have with your team are dependent on several factors, including the management style, the location of the teams, and so on. Each meeting should have a focus or purpose, a defined regularity, a target audience, and a clear objective. And for me, there are 4 useful focuses for meetings within consultancies: a cascade where information from the top is disseminated down, reporting where team progress is reported upwards, decision-making where options and recommendations are decided upon, and steering and governance type meetings. I think designing and communicating a meeting schedule from top down allows a lot of clarity in planning and reduces the risk of what you might call organic or low-value meeting build-up, which happens in all organizations. The purpose of internal reporting is to provide accurate, timely, relevant information about the performance and activities of consultancy. Internal reports include both data and information, typically produced at regular intervals, or you may have them continually available through the BI platforms. And these reports enable consultancy leaders to oversee the performance of the operational function, to communicate analysis, and they may trigger actions or decisions. Meetings are boring but important. Look, you have to have communication there. That's my key takeaway from that. Much as it's the responsibility of a divisional leader to get the best out of their leadership, a local leader has responsibility to get the best out of the delivery employees in their team. And there are countless leadership models. Consultancy is a profession with great variety. So the type of model you might choose as a consultant leader is situational dependent. Some of the most important and relevant to consultants, I think, and consultancies are on the screen right now. So they include competence frameworks to help you differentiate between levels of skill, matrix management, that's needed in large-scale organizations, coaching, which develops an individual using insightful questions, and mentoring, which pairs people up for more rapid knowledge transfer. A divisional leader needs a toolkit of those models to apply to given situations. And I think, to get better at any technique, the divisional leader needs to practice them all. And section 5, our fifth and final section, about how to manage consultancy finances. And according to Michael Gerber, who's the author of The E-Myth, which is a book I would certainly recommend. I think it's a second version now, The E-Myth Revisited. There are 4 types of money that you need to be aware of when you're a leader within a professional services firm, such as a consultancy. He talks about wider things as well. The first kind of money is income, the money that consultancy is paid for delivering services, also known as revenue or turnover. The second kind of money, profit, and profit's what's left after all the expenses of delivering the service have been paid. The third kind of money is cash flow. And cash flow is the movement of money in and out of a business. And the fourth type is equity, which is the value of your business that someone else would be willing to pay for it. The importance of each type of money to the business can change as circumstances change. Some things become more urgent, and the ability to change focus quickly but clearly and to be able to communicate this to the teams is a skill which senior leaders need to learn. They need to be able to communicate about the different types of money and the value of that money at that point. Your profit and loss is your key financial report. It includes your key financial measurements, including revenue, cost of sales, gross profit and gross margin. These are the above the line elements. It also includes the operating costs, which are broadly divided into 2 in my mind. I find it useful. The costs of everyone who's not working on an assignment and all the other costs of running the business. And these are the below the line elements. Being able to read your profit and loss in order to spot issues is a skill that develops with practice. And although it's a historical document, seeing trends in the document helps you begin to predict what might happen in the future and where to intervene if you have to. There's much more to a profit and loss statement, but it's a document that leaders of all levels should be familiar with to help ensure the financial health of the organization. Now we've covered those key financial terms, we'll explain how they relate to a key activity in managing consultancies, and that's setting budgets. And on a regular basis, typically yearly, a consultancy will set targets for financial performance and incorporate this into a budget to ensure that the business has sufficient money and cash flow to remain viable and achieve its goals. The budget is therefore a forward projection of the profit and loss, as well as the cash flow. And the budgeting process and the finalized budget itself helps financial planning and control. But importantly, it's a communication and accountability tool for the organizational leadership. So to set a budget, you go through a process of analyzing current financial trajectory, setting top level and then more detailed targets, calculating cost of sales and operating expenses, and then iterating a few times before you finalize and communicate. A budget's a plan, and like all plans, it needs review and buy-in from the wider organization. Let's talk rates. And I'll keep it simple and just looking at time and materials type rates. And there are two fundamental situations where you need to address the issue of setting rates. They are when you enter the market from scratch, where you need to find a rate that gets you in the door, but doesn't undervalue what you do. And then when a rate has been set and you need that to change because of market changes or changes in the value that you provide. In either situation, there are several factors that go into the setting of rates, and you need to be in a position to calculate an optimum rate and often explain that to the client. This includes the market conditions, the financial overheads, the scope or complexity of the work performed, the company and individual experience, as well as having a factor in usually for your market reputation. Companies often shy away from raising rates, but if it's planned and transparent, there's no reason to fear this important process. Communicate your rises in advance, have a clear trail, and be ready to manage reluctance if and when it comes along, and it may do. For consultancies with a permanent delivery workforce, utilization is important. And utilization is the percentage of time that a person or group of people are on client assignment. High utilization affects the profit and loss by returning a higher gross revenue and lower below the line costs. Since consultants are often the most valuable and expensive assets in a consultancy, it's obviously important to use their time effectively. And utilization can be measured at a number of levels. The organizational level, this helps you ensure budget adherence and help in meeting the rest of your organizational targets. The divisional level, to identify risk areas in divisions or shuffle resources between divisions. The service level, which helps you assess the success of the service line. The position or role level, which ensures optimum use of the different seniority levels, and this is related back to leverage. And the individual level, which helps you identify potential over or underachievers or uncover other individual issues. Organizations don't typically target for 100% utilization. They usually have different utilization expectations for different levels. And by optimizing utilization, you do achieve more profitability and flexibility. And finally, let's talk about cost. Oh, and it's gone. Yeah, we are. Yeah. Cost control is important so that the company can spend on the things it really needs to be able to, often salaries. And it's a positive behavior, cost control. It's aimed at wise organizational spending and reducing leakage. And in fact, consultancies are such dynamic organizations, they often act in ways that leak money. Cost control shouldn't be confused with cost cutting, which is an emergency measure to reduce a financial problem. And as the primary resource in a consultancy is its employees, as we said, then leakage is often a problem of poor use of people. It's a particular problem for time and materials engagements, which do make up a large proportion of engagements for many consultancies. There are dozens of potential leakage points. In fact, at one point, I managed to find 85 leakage points in an organizational check I was doing. So lots of places where you can leak money. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is that. I think 149. It's gone a little bit longer than I hoped. I did know there was a lot of material in there. It probably took us about 40 minutes or so in total, so a little longer. But I'd like to open up for any questions.